I'm Barbara Parnas, speaking on behalf of Historic Saranac Lake, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I first want to give a very special welcome to some very special people. These are our returning and new reunionees. Some of the audience is interested local people, friends of Historic Saranac Lake, but I would like to hear a round of applause for our people who've come to reminisce about their days and to be part of this reunion. And this is the first public program under this three-day reunion. Lots of you were at the tea this afternoon, and that was kind of a chance to begin to reminisce. But this particular evening is also, I think, of interest to you because we conceived the idea last year of presenting a program of readings from people who wrote about their experiences in beginning with Dr. E.L. Trudeau and coming right up to Henry Laram. We conceived of this idea last year, and we were funded by a 6 counties program and the New York State Council on the Arts. And because we needed a way to present this, what better way than to have the Pendragon theater players, who are our very fine local repertory theater. And they were very receptive to the idea of presenting these readings, and they did so last year. And they will be with us in a very few minutes to give the program again. We've added a new person, thanks to Elise Chapin, Henry Laram, a poet, and we've changed the reading from Dr. Trudeau to something a little more specific to taking the cure days. And I think you'll enjoy it. And I'd like to remind you to be, if you need a ride tomorrow for the tours, please turn up at about 8:45 out front of the hotel. Lots of you have your own cars, you have your own maps, and so on. But we do have a full morning, and we'd like to start it more or less on time. So if you'll turn up, if you need the rides, and I think you've signed up, so we look forward to seeing you then. But I know you're going to enjoy this evening, and without any more, we'll see the Pendragon players doing dramatic readings of Time to Cure, Time to Write. Thanks.
Good evening. Welcome to A Time to Cure, A Time to Write, the second reading of works by Saranac Lake writers and writers who came to Saranac Lake during the Cure Days. Many have recuperated in Saranac Lake and then gone on to write about distant places and events. This evening, however, we focus on those who chronicled their battle with the disease of tuberculosis in the place of hope called Saranac Lake. The idea for this presentation came about, first of all, because we love literature and love to read it. Its most essential component was, obviously, bed rest. The patient lay in a bed or a cure chair on a porch all day, every day, until he or she was strong enough for brief periods of exercise. The obvious side benefit to this forced inaction was the opportunity to feel and to reflect. Imagine if you yourself had a year of days in which to just think. Of course, in this day and age, no one has time for such things. We're all too busy being productive. But it was no surprise that for many, the experience was transforming. Among those whose lives it transformed were the writers we read today. Another side benefit to the rest cure and a community where others came to cure was the material it provided to a writer. Here was a subject with any great number of angles and possibilities. Illness and recovery, friendships with all kinds of people, from Philippine generals to New York vaudeville artists, fear, hope, and courage against the beautiful Adirondack backdrop. Those who wrote about their curing days did us the favor of capturing aspects of our history which would otherwise be lost. As Historic Saranac Lake is here to remind us, our history matters. It is part of what makes our village special. We begin appropriately with the man most responsible for the development of Saranac Lake as a pioneer health resort, Dr. Edward Livingston Trudeau, the founder of the Adirondack Cottage Sanitarium, later renamed the Trudeau Sanatorium. The following excerpts are taken from his autobiography. The first selection deals with Miss Mary Prescott and the beginnings of the Reception Hospital.
In the late 90s, I had a patient, Miss Mary R. Prescott, who has long ago become a very dear friend to my wife and to me, and who recovered her health completely in Saranac Lake. With her return to health, her active mind and warm heart chafed under the ease and enforced inactivity of a well-to-do patient's life. And in spite of her restored strength, her spirits began to flag and life to seem meaningless to her. I saw at once that what she needed was an active interest of some kind, and as she had ample means, I suggested that she hire a cottage, put a nurse in charge, and start a little hospital of her own, where a few advanced cases and those who were refused admission to the sanitarium and needed rest in bed and nursing could be taken care for at a nominal cost. I told her I knew Dr. Baldwin and some of the physicians would gladly do the medical work, and thus she would bring relief and encouragement to a class of invalids in sore need of it, for whom little or nothing was being done. She at once became interested in the plan, hired a cottage, put a nurse in charge, and cared for 4 patients at first at a nominal cost to them of $6 or $7 per week. Dr. Baldwin and some of the younger physicians volunteered their services in visiting the patients without remuneration. And this was the starting point of the Reception Hospital, which Miss Prescott built in 1905. She raised a good share of the funds for building and equipping the institution by appeals to her personal friends and supplemented this from her own purse. She has herself met the deficit in running expenses ever since, asking the public only to accumulate a free bed fund for the destitute. Dr. E.R. Baldwin has directed the medical work ever since the institution was opened. The Reception Hospital is a model of its kind in plan, construction, and equipment, with its cheery rooms, its sleeping out porches, and its atmosphere of home. The devoted souls who preside over this abode of cheer are peace, are 2 Canadian-trained nurses, Miss Sophie Herner, who took charge of Miss Prescott's first little cottage, and Miss Ethel Mathias. Under their administrations, many a storm-tossed and discouraged human being has here found welcome, cheer, and good nursing, while the doctors have ever given them the most skillful medical care. A certain number of patients, after a time, are found to be favorable for admission to the sanitarium. For the Reception Hospital, as for the sanitarium, there is always a waiting list, and this illustrates the magnitude of the tuberculosis problem. In the building and supporting of her admirable charity, Miss Prescott's bank account has been steadily and often heavily taxed, but her unrest and depression have long ago vanished, and her life of helpfulness to others has been full of keen interest, satisfaction, and peace.
This second piece gives us a picture of Dr. Trudeau's summers, both in Paul Smith's and Saranac Lake, and in particular his encounter with a tramp. These brief selections, taken from later in his Adirondack years, illustrate his warmth and dedication.
Everybody in the village had a curious idea that the 3 months I spent at Paul Smith's were entirely a holiday for me, but nothing was further from the truth. For 25 years, I did all the summer practice at Paul Smith's and in the camps, and though this at times was pretty strenuous, I was glad to have it, as it helped very materially to meet the growing expenses of my family, toward which, of course, the sanitarium and the laboratory contributed nothing. On 2 days each week, I went to Saranac Lake for consultation hours in my office, and those 2 days were active indeed. After doing what was necessary at Paul Smith's, often having to get up at an early hour to accomplish this, my wife and I would start at 11 o'clock in an open buggy — I never had a top buggy — and drive over to Saranac Lake, 14 miles, often through intense heat or storm, reaching there after 1 o'clock. My office hour was at 2, but often by the time we arrived, my waiting room, piazza, and even the lawn were frequently occupied by patients. A hasty lunch and then 5 hours of office work. Rich and poor, young and old, were in that waiting crowd. And by 7 o'clock, I usually manage to see all of them and give them some sort of advice as to their cases and their mode of life. I am sure toward the end of these long hours, I must have slighted my work, for I could hardly keep my mind on the patient's cases, and I was numb with mental and physical exhaustion. I remember after one unusually long afternoon, I was tired out and irritable. I thought the last patient had been disposed of and I was through. When I looked out and I saw a wretched man waiting. So I opened the door and in no very pleasant tone told him to walk in. He was a tall, emaciated tramp, the picture of the last stages of pulmonary tuberculosis, and my heart softened. He sat down, put his hands in his pockets, and stared at me. "Be you Dr. Trudeau?" I said, "Yes." "Well, now you don't look none like a doctor. You look like one of them bicycle fellows." The change in my habits from hunter to physician had not yet made me discard the knickerbockers and leather leggings of hunting days, and it was my costume that called forth his remark. "Well," I said, "what is the matter with you?" "What is the matter with me? Why, can't you see I'm almost dead with the consumption?" He was certainly plain spoken. He told me he had been sent to one of the large tuberculosis hospitals of Brooklyn. "But I looked about me," he said, "and sized things up a bit. There were about 50 sick blokes in that ward, and after I had been there 3 days and seen many of them carried out feet first, I realized that was going to happen to me soon if I did not get out of that place. So I lit out. I had heard speak in that ward of you and Saranac Lake, and that you ran a place where people really did get well if they wasn't too far gone. So I made up my mind to strike out for Saranac Lake. I hadn't a cent, and I was pretty weak, but I begged enough for a fare to Yonkers. And when I got to there, I went down the street and rang every doorbell and begged cold victuals until I got something to eat. But I was soon rounded up, put in the poorhouse. When they had looked me over, however, they made up their minds I was likely to die on their hands, and that it would be cheaper to buy me a ticket to the next place and let me die on someone else's hands. So they gave me a ticket and packed me off, and in that way I finally got here. Now, what can you do for me, doctor? What a tale. My horse was waiting at the door, so I told this poor fellow I would take him to some cheap boarding place and would see him through until I could think of something else to do. He got in the wagon, and I asked him, "What has brought you to this drink?" "Oh, no, doctor, I have tried to drink several times, but it don't agree with me." He never uttered any complaint, but took his hard fate as rather a curious experience. He decided he could support himself by selling fruit. So, by telling of his wants to some of my patients, he got enough money to build a little rough board shanty on a vacant lot. There he slept on a straw bed, and the hotel proprietor would allow him to come for scraps off the table, on which he lived quite contentedly all summer. He remained 18 months and improved in health. He supported himself entirely and was a most interesting and grateful patient. I used to take him about with me in the wagon occasionally while making my calls. One night, he suddenly disappeared from Saranac Lake, and I have never heard a word from him since. The only inkling I have of his reason for going was his telling me that he thought it was getting too cold for him and that he would prefer wintering in the south. I have often wondered how he managed to get south, but I don't doubt he accomplished it.
Song by Adelaide Crapsey. I make my shroud, but no one knows, so shimmering fine it is and fair. With stitches set in even rows, I make my shroud, but no one knows. In doorway where the lilac blows, humming a little wandering air, I make my shroud, and no one knows, so shimmering fine it is and fair.
Adelaide Crapsey's poems were first published in volume 4 after her death at age 35 of tuberculosis. Adelaide was an educated woman before the time when this became commonplace, who studied at Vassar and taught at Smith College. Her subject was poetics, the technical aspects of poetry, meter, and form. She invented a form called the cinquain, 5-line poem, one of the shortest verse forms in English. After Adelaide contracted TB, she wrote sanquins about her illness and curing days, but the subject seemed too big for the form she created.
Triad. These be 3 silent things: the falling snow, the hour before dawn, the mouth of one just dead. November night. Listen, with faint, dry sound like steps of passing ghosts, the leaves, frost-crisped, break from the trees and fall. The warning. Just now, out of the strange, still dusk, as strange as still, the white moth flew. Why am I grown so cold?
It was as if her passion and will to live had to be more fully expressed, so she spilled them out into a free verse form in what may be her best poem, To the Dead in the Graveyard Under My Window, written in a moment of exasperation.
How can you lie so still? All day I watch, and never a blade of all the green sod moves to show where restlessly you toss and turn, and fling a desperate arm or draw knees, stiffened and aching from their long disuse. I watch all night, and not one ghost comes forth to take its freedom of the midnight hour. Oh, have you no rebellion in your bones? The very worms must scorn you where you lie, a pallid, moldering, acquiescent folk, meek inhabitants of unresented graves. Why are you there in your straight row on row, where I must ever see you from my bed, that in your mere dumb presence iterate the text so weary in my ears? Lie still and rest. Be patient and lie still and rest. I'll not be patient. I will not lie still. There is a brown road runs between the pines, and further on the purple woodlands lie, and still beyond blue mountains lift and loom. And I would walk the road, and I would be deep in the wooded shade, and I would reach the windy mountain tops that touch the clouds. My eyes may follow, but my feet are held. Recumbent, as you others, must I too submit, be mimic of your movelessness with pillow and counterpane before stones beside. And if the many sayings of the wise teach of submission, I will not submit, but with a spirit all unreconciled, flash an unquenched defiance to the stars. Better it is to walk, to run, to dance. Better it is to laugh and leap and sing, to know the open skies of dawn and night, to move untrammeled down the flaming noon. And I will clamber it through weary days, keeping the edge of deprivation sharp, nor with the pliant speaking on my lips of resignation, sister to defeat. I'll not be patient. I will not lie still. And in ironic quietude, who is the despot of our days and lord of dust, needs but, scarce heeding, wait to drop, grim casual comment on rebellion's end. Yes, yes, willful and petulant, but the now as dead and quiet as the others are. And this each body and ghost of you hath heard, that in your graves do therefore lie so still.
In 1928, a 19-year-old girl named Isabel Smith arrived at Union Station in Saranac Lake and was taken by ambulance to a nursing cottage on St. Bernard Street. For the next 21 years, Isabel took the cure. Hers was an extreme case, and her courage was indomitable. The reading is taken from her autobiography.
Now it was autumn again, the autumn of 1931. I had lived at Saranac Lake for 3 years, but I was beginning to note time by the seasons now and lose track of the years. Again, Dr. Trudeau was shaking his head over the high points on my temperature chart and other signs of slipping which I was once more exhibiting. In spite of this warning, however, his sudden announcement over my dinner tray one October Sunday that I was moving to Luddington Infirmary the next day was such a surprise that it left me shocked and speechless, thereby giving my wily physician a chance to tiptoe out of the room before I could air my protests. Ludington Infirmary meant Trudeau Sanatorium. It meant moving a mile away from this house, which had become home to me. It meant leaving my friends, leaving Delia the nurse whose kindness and good care I could not possibly do without. Most distressing of all, it meant that Dr. Trudeau would no longer be my personal physician. Now, everything I had heard about the SAN was undeniably good. Its hand-picked medical staff, whose members knew so much about tuberculosis that they served as teachers to student doctors in an annual Trudeau School of Tuberculosis. The skill of its nurses, who were trained in caring for just such patients as I. The beauty of its surroundings, located against a backdrop of mountains that you could actually see. I should have been pleased and even honored that it offered me a bed, for Trudeau did not as a rule admit patients who were more than moderately ill. But I liked this village of Saranac curling around Flower Lake. Although I'd seen woefully little of it, I felt that I knew it well. As I lay watching the people on the streets or looking across to other porches, I could see that here, tuberculosis was not something to be feared as it had been in a hospital in New York, where everyone had approached me wearing a mask, but merely to be cured, in buoyant friendliness and understanding. Look at those patients walking along the sidewalk. Confronted with the steepness of Helen Hill, they had to slow down to a crawl. But Saranac Lake comprehended their plight. Like as not, before they reached the top, a car would stop and give them a lift. So, the following morning, I said a dejected goodbye to everyone and buried my face in Delia's arms. Then we each sipped a glass of sherry to celebrate the catastrophe and possibly to brighten my outlook. It merely succeeded in blurring it, however. When I arrived at Ludington Infirmary and followed a starched white figure into my new home, I flounced, pouting, into bed and lay there staring at the ceiling, hating each and every crack. My dinner tray arrived. I took one look and refused to eat. Well, for those delectable dishes that Delia had served, I began counting the days until my 3-month sentence should end. With the coming of rest hour, a short, stocky, white-coated orderly appeared. This was Peter, and as he wheeled my bed out on the porch, he received the words that I was muttering with an indifference which indicated that the vagaries of feminine temperament were to him an old, old story. I might as well save my breath. Out he trundled me onto a high, broad porch, and as my bed neared the windows, suddenly I beheld the mountains. I was seeing them at last. The impact of their size and color under the bright October sun knocked the chip right off my shoulder. I cried out in surprise and delight. Stalwart and reassuring, they stood, awaiting me. The darkness of evergreen modeling their contours, their sides splashed with patches of crimson, russet, and gold. Immediately before me rose Mount Baker, borrowed straight from those Allegheny foothills that I knew so well. Behind it loomed even higher peaks whose names I had yet to learn, crowding northward, one upon the other. To the south, the Great Range edged the horizon with a scalloped silhouette as crooked and uneven as a child's cutout. And so intent was I in absorbing every curve and peak that it was a few minutes before my gaze descended into the valley below my porch. And there I came upon the glint of a river twisting and turning through woods and marsh. And so there came to me when I needed it most, one of the great joys of my life, the sight of hills and a stream. By now, the redoubtable Peter was creakily pushing another bed to the far side of my porch, but the impassive face that he had exhibited to me now wore a broad grin as Irish as his brogue. Peter brought me a friend. My dear Elizabeth, how lucky I was to find you on that porch. All I could see of you in that first quick glimpse was a slight shawled figure. Then a pale face with delicate features peered out and whispered hello. You had been chortling rather hoarsely over some sally that Peter had made, and the corners of your gray-green eyes were crinkled with laughter. But you looked so frail that you couldn't even talk. I was afraid to say more than a few words. You set my mind at ease in a hurry, however. You could whisper better than lots of people can shout, and the merriment that bubbled from you frequently must have come straight from some deep fount of your spirit. Rest hour with the nurse's finger admonishingly upon her lips, was a poor time to get acquainted. Nevertheless, we managed, with whispers, arms, and nodding heads, to make it clear who we were and from whence we came. The fact that you had been a medical librarian in Boston and I a nurse in New York City really didn't matter much anymore. Now we were just two similar bumps under the bedclothes of two identical beds. So we hurried on to the important business at hand, how we were rather than who. I could hardly wait to tell you how long I'd been sick. 3 whole years, it seemed an eternity. In fact, everything that had happened to me since I took to bed seemed so serious and complicated that by the time I finished my story and settled back to listen to what you might have to say, I felt I was surely somebody, albeit in a sickly sort of way. I did not retain that feeling long. The facts that you related about your 12 months in bed left me shocked and aghast. How could any one person ever have lived through so much? I was filled with sympathy for you and shame for myself. I had made much of my tribulations. You had quietly understated yours. It hit me with something of a shock that I must have been feeling inexcusably sorry for myself. I, who had prided myself on my stiff upper lip. Peter came along just then to push our beds back into our rooms, and it was a good thing he did, because I needed time out to think. I was taking a good look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw. Never, never will I feel sorry for myself again, I vowed in a heady burst of high-mindedness. I'll save my pity for someone else. That promise proved to be one I could not keep, however. When hurt, I inevitably licked my wounds. But I had learned one thing, and that was when to stop. I never again felt singled out as somebody of any sort. For better or worse, I was one of a crowd in which none of us felt too good. But I was happiest when, far from the hustle and bustle of the hall, with the office window tightly closed upon its secrets, I shared the quiet serenity of our porch with Elizabeth within and the mountains without, both equally dear to me. There we lay in a mutual companionship so deep and satisfying that much of the time we had no need for words. We lay there silently, high above the humdrum world, with clouds at our feet by day and at night the stars. And on one occasion, at least, we had, I am sure, the universe. For some time, we had been reading in the newspapers about an impending shower of meteors, the Leonids, I think they were called. Neither of us had ever seen such a sight, and the very thought of it kept us at a high pitch of excitement for days. We were determined to see this spectacle, rules or no rules, TB or no TB. No matter how much sleep we might have to miss, we decided that our souls would benefit more by such celestial magnificence than our lungs would suffer. The momentous November evening arrived, fine and clear, and as soon as the night nurse had tucked us in and departed, we promptly pulled the tucks out again and sat upright, banking our pillows behind us for support. We could see the stars glimmering everywhere just as usual, with no hint of the turmoil to come. By midnight, we seemed to be the only 2 people awake in the world, such was the quiet around us. Then, suddenly, a curving streak of light flashed across the velvet blackness to my right. The show was beginning. Before it could fade, another and another appeared, each illuminating briefly a patch of deepest blue. The crisscross pattern of lights increased, even brightened as the night wore on, until it seemed as if the entire heavens were in chaos, with stars breaking from their orderly courses to shoot wherever they willed, momentarily splitting the dark dome of the night with 1,000,000 white cracks. And all this in a silence complete and awesome. I was filled with exultation as I turned my head this way and that, watching these incandescent fragments of an ancient comet soar wildly, gloriously through eons of time and illimitable space. It was after 3 in the morning when Elizabeth and I finally leaned back on our pillows, exhausted but afire with joy, for we too had escaped as our eyes followed the meteors in their plunge through the void. We had burst our own chains of time and sickness during these hours. And although we were now lying once again flat in our beds, the burden we bore within our chests seemed lighter than it had before.
Marshall's wife, Helene, consulted a doctor. They lived at the time in Cleveland. You have tuberculosis, the doctor said. In fact, Helene's lungs bore scars which revealed that she had suffered from TB undiagnosed since childhood. You must go to Saranac at once, the doctor said. That is the best place to cure. Helene did not want to go to a place with, quote, nothing but sick people all around you. The doctor insisted that Saranac was a wonderful place, and so they went.
Trip to Saranac fatigued us. Early in the morning, we left our train in Utica and waited 2 hours for the Adirondack local. The train was hot and stuffy and dirty. It chugged in a leisurely fashion out of the Utica station and headed in a northerly direction. At every little shanty beside the track, the train jolted to a stop. The baggage man chatted with the station agent, gave him a bundle of newspapers, and the train jerked itself away. As the morning wore on, it became hotter and dirtier. Marco was hungry, but his milk had turned sour and he would have none of it. He slept fitfully, but he did not cry. All three of us were very hungry, but there was nothing to eat. The country we climbed into was beautiful. Higher and higher mountains slipped past us, deeper lakes and thicker pine trees. The engine puffed and strained. The grade was steep. But the train ducked into a gulch through two mountains, curved around a rippling lake, and wandered hesitatingly away from the towering peak. God, this is what we've been waiting for, this country. Yes, but you won't be in it, said Elise. At Lake Clear Junction, we changed to another train that sailed downgrade into Saranac Lake. We stood on the platform and looked around. Behind us, a wooded hill went steeply up to the Rocky Bluff Point. Before us, the big red building of the lumber company. A taxi driver approached. "What's a good hotel?" I asked. "Saranac," he said. We climbed into the car. We passed a few houses such as are seen only in Saranac. Houses with porches on every side, at every corner. Porches tacked precariously on the sides, jutting out from second and third floor rooms. The porches were screened and glassed, and on all of them were men and women lying in long reclining chairs, men and women lying silent and unmoving. A few reading, but most just lying there silent and unmoving. On some porches we could see white iron beds, and in the beds lay patients, looking quietly out the windows, looking at nothing. These people were sick, all of them sick. Helene stared at every porch. Her smile was gone, and her face was serious. She looked at me and tried to smile. Oh, God, Mike, what's the use? I know now for the first time that I'm sick. I'm like those people on the porches, sick. No matter how rotten I felt, I have not known that until now. Until now, it has not been real to me. I've not grasped it except at the surface of my mind, but now I know it. I know it to the bottom of me, down into my feelings. I'm sick. The car stopped in front of the hotel, and the boy took our bags. We registered and were shown into our room. I saw the stationery had printed on it, "No invalids allowed." And we wondered if we would be put out when they heard Helene cough. I went across the street and down half a block to the house in which I found the offices of Dr. Orton and Dr. Crow. A woman came to the door in answer to my ring, and I asked for Dr. Orton. "Dr. Orton is in Europe. Would you care to make an appointment with Dr. Crowley, his associate?" Well, I made an appointment for Helene for 10 o'clock in the next morning and returned to the hotel room. Marco had fallen asleep in the middle of the bed, and Helene and I whispered to one another and tiptoed around the room. The silence of the town was uncanny. We thought the president had died, put the village in mourning. Our room faced the main street, but even with the window open, not a sound came to us. We sat expectantly, waiting for noise. for sound of life. Silence, quiet. And the air was just as strange. It seemed perfumed, fresh, alive. For several days, we were consciously aware of the quality of this clear air. We sat by the window, silent and wrapped in silence.
Alan Seeger, born in 1906, won a Rhodes Scholarship at the University of Michigan and went off to study at Oxford. During his second year there, when he was 21, he discovered that he had TB. He broke off his studies and came to the Trudeau Sanatorium to cure. He later said that the title of his memoirs about his youth, A Frieze of Girls, came from an image he had when a luncheon companion asked him, "If you think of your life at age 20, what comes back first?" Seeger replied, "It was a kind of frieze of girls and long, aimless car rides at night."
Toward the 1st of July, the doctor told me that there was a vacancy coming up at the Trudeau Sanitarium in Saranac. Now, at Trudeau, you had to be ambulant. So the doctor said that I could start sitting up on the edge of my bed with my feet hanging over for 20 minutes a day. Next, I would be sitting in a chair, and then presumably a few tottering steps around the room. Well, I didn't dare tell them that I could already walk all right, so I went through their routine for 3 days. The first day that I was allowed to walk, I decided to take a tub bath. So I left my room and I walked down the middle of the corridor without hanging on to anything. Well, the nurses, they came like a flight of birds. They settled on me, twittering and clucking and trying to get me to let them bear me up. But I said, "No, beat it, ladies, I'm all right." And I walked onto the bathroom, and I drew a bath, and I lay in it. And it felt good after all those months of wet wash rags. Well, the day I left, the head nurse told me that the traveler's aide would meet me at the station in Detroit to see that I was wheeled safely to the train for Saranac. Well, I said that I didn't need a wheelchair, but the head nurse, wrinkled with duty, said that I must have one. So a friend of mine, a girl, came with me as far as Detroit. Now, she had thoughtfully brought along a pint of Golden Wedding. It was a favorite among the local bootleggers. I took a compartment for privacy, and we drank the frightful whiskey from paper cups with water, and laughed the whole way. Now, the countryside looked fresh and new, and so did the girl. We had a wonderful time. Well, as the train slowed down in the Detroit station, I saw a tiny little old lady pushing one of those high-backed wooden wheelchairs along beside the train. She wore a cloth hat with a label sewn on the front with Traveler's Aid on it. Now, if I didn't get into that wheelchair, nobody would, and she would have come all this way for nothing. But if I did get into it, could she push me? See, I had shot up to 180 pounds. Well, the train stopped, and I had to face my problem. Now, if I seemed to stagger as I got off, it was not from the weakness of my malady. So, it stopped, and I got off, and I said goodbye to the girl, and I walked as circumspectly as I could over to the old lady. "Were you expecting a TB patient from Ann Arbor, madam?" "Yes, I was," she said. Well, I could tell that she was tough and conscientious. "Well, I didn't really need a wheelchair. It was ordered for you. Get in." I got in. Well, it was embarrassing enough, this little woman bending to the task of rolling a big, healthy-looking guy around a railroad station. Most TB patients look healthy, they eat so much. But I must have assumed what I can only describe as a roistering pose in that wheelchair because a well-dressed woman passed, and I heard her say to her companion, "I didn't know they did that for lushes." Well, the Trudeau Sanitarium is now obsolete. Its services discontinued, and its buildings house a high-level project having to do with, well, I believe the theory of games. In my day, it was rather like living in a fraternity again. The men and the women were separated and assigned to cottages, each with a space for 12 or 15 people. And you had a dressing room and a screened porch where you slept. Now, my porch mate was a Swiss who said he was a mechanical dentist. Well, this seemed to me that his trade was making dentures, and apparently to keep his hand in, there were always a few loose teeth scattered on the table in his dressing room. Now, meals were served in a central dining hall, and after each one, you returned to your porch to cure. Now, curing was lying still, breathing the fresh mountain air, and sleeping, if possible. Now, I couldn't do this because of Carl's problem. He not only had chest TB, but he also had some kind of hyperthyroidism, and he couldn't sit still. He paced up and down ceaselessly and meaninglessly all day like a big cat in a zoo. Now, in October, when the snow came, he nearly prevented me from sleeping at night, too. See, I was persuaded by one of my friends to buy an early electric blanket. It was warm, but a fairly primitive affair, which shorted on a couple of my friends who were awakened in the dead of night by little rings of flame dancing on the bedclothes. Carl, however, although he had plenty, was close with his money. He had so many woolen blankets on his bed that he had to use a bookmark that he pinched from the library to tell where to insert himself. About 8 o'clock at night, he would start to prepare for bed. He would pull on the pants to a sweatsuit over a pair of flannel pajamas, tie the ankles, crumple the New York Times and the Herald Tribune, and stuff them down his legs until he looked like a tackling dummy. And then he would tie the waist, and he would stuff the top, put on a knitted cap, 2 pair of wool socks, a pair of gauntlets, and he would get into bed and rustle. Now, this is enough to deter, if not prevent sleep entirely. But he did get very cold there, and these precautions, wool or electric, were necessary. It was often 40 below at night, and for 2 weeks it didn't get above 12 below at noon. Usually, you slept on your back with 2 pillows crisscrossed over your face, the Adirondack pack. And then you pulled the blankets up to the base of your nose, leaving only it exposed and greasing it beforehand so that it wouldn't freeze to the pillow. You know, it was Carl who challenged George Kelly to a duel, implementing the challenge with a case of pistols with beautiful long blue barrels. Now I knew by this time that worry and confinement could make people strange, but when I heard that Carl wanted George to go up in the mountains with a second and stand back to back and each take 10 paces forward, turn and fire, you know, like in the novels, I didn't believe it. I asked Carl to show me the pistols, and he did. But he wouldn't say how George has insulted him. But it was a sure thing that George had done something, or said something, that could be taken as an insult. George was a big, shrewd, red-faced, knowledgeable Irishman. The year before, he'd been playing tackle for Manhattan College. Someone threw a block on him, and he coughed up half a pint of blood on the field. Now, they tried to get him to the doctor, but he waved them away. No, I'll just finish the season. Played 4 more games, let the doctor examine him, and he was sent post-haste to Saranac. But he knew what he had all the time. His parents had died of it. Well, I mean, he was a bad patient because he treated the disease with scorn. I mean, it was ridiculous to be felled by Lilliputian bugs, 50,000 of which we're told could pass through the eye of a needle without touching the sides or one another. And so he made elaborate jokes about it that set the whole sanitarium laughing. He took our common plight contemptuously. He turned it upside down, inside out, and for all but the butts of them, his jokes wore away the endemic fear that seemed to hover in the spruce trees at night when the wind kept you awake. See, in a sanitarium, everybody is passive, waiting, hopefully. George was active. There was a man from the Long Island City Fire Department. I forgot his name, but we all called him Chief. Now, Chief was a friendly, round little guy, and well, he was just the sort of guy that they call in the South, blood simple. Now, he didn't have TB. He had osteomyelitis on his ribs. So sort of a moss, he said. So he had to have an operation to remove the affected parts. Since it was similar, well, perhaps identical to the operation for the removal of ribs in TB, he'd been sent up here. He didn't have to cure, so he had the run of the place at all hours. Well, one day George Kelly got hold of him. How long before they give you the rib, Chief? Oh, 3 or 4 days. Thursday, I guess. George, with his elbows on his knees, he looked at the floor and he said, "Mm-hmm. You feel pretty good?" "Oh, yeah, George. Yeah, I mean, I feel fine, you know?" Yeah, George said, frowning, "but I mean mentally." Mentally? An expression of wonder came over Chief's face. You know, nobody had ever asked him that before, apparently. "What do you mean, like how I feel in my mind?" "Well, wonderful, never better." "Well, you sound as though you were looking forward to it," said George. "Well, it's coming. I gotta do it. What else?" "Yeah, sure." George looked at him. "You know, back in Long Island City, when that fire bell rings, you slide down the ladder, don't you?" Chief said, "I ain't always in bed when the bell rings. Sometimes I'm playing checkers." "Well, okay. So jump up, or you slide down, or you get on the truck and you zoom off to the fire, and you run up a ladder and you wrestle a hose." "Oh, come on, it's more technical than that, George." "Yeah, but damn it, that's what you do, isn't it?" George roared. "Well, gee, yeah, but..." "Well, look, all I'm asking you to do is think. Do you think you'll be able to do this after the operation?" "Well, sure. They said..." They said. And George spat right on the floor. A grave offense here. "Now look, Chief, you know Doc Spidell, the first assistant surgeon?" "Sure." "You know how he limps when he walks? You know, kind of pushes his right leg out?" "Yes, bone TB, Chief said confidently. He had his knee scraped, they said." "Yeah, they said." "Spidell had the rib too, didn't he?" "Yeah," Chief said. "Well, the reason he keeps pushing with that leg when he walks is to keep him going in a straight line. You see, Chief, what they don't tell you is when you get the rib, it destroys your sense of direction. You walk around in circles." Well, Chief stared at George. "I'll give you 10 seconds. "Honest?" he said. "Look at Spidell. Now, he's smart, huh? He worked it out. He pushes. But I don't know about you getting up on a ladder. I mean, how are you going to walk around in circles on top of a ladder, huh?" Well, Chief listened no more. He spun around and he ran out of that cottage. Now, you're supposed to walk, and no faster than 2.5 miles an hour. But Chief ran like a whitehead. Well, Dr. Spidell was with a patient, but Chief burst into the office, waving his arms and shouting, "Oh, no, you can't do this to me. No, I know all about you, Doc. No, sir, you can't do this to me. I ain't gonna let you." "Oh, what's the matter, Chief?" said Dr. Spidell. "You cut out my ribs? No, sir. Take away my job? No, I know all about you, Doctor. No, sir, you can't do it," Chief battled. "Rest of my life walking around in circles? No." Well, patients blow their tops not infrequently, and Spidell was used to this. You know, the confinement and the strict regimen, worry about money and worry about death. But he also recognized a sinister foreign richness in the inventions of Chief's outburst. Who have you been talking to, George Kelly?" "You bet, he's the only friend I've got here." Well, wearily, Doc Spidell went to work cleaning up after George. It took about an hour to calm Chief down and settle him down for the operation. Later, he chewed out George, but half-heartedly. Because I think that he obscurely knew that George was on his side, deviously, obliquely on the side of life. Well, time had taught the authorities that the Puritanic regimen so beneficial to the disease could not be maintained without any breaks. It sent people up the wall. So with no official announcement, merely the seepage of a custom, new patients learned that the week between Christmas and New Year's was a licensed Saturnalia. If you did not fall on your face before the head, you could carouse. And visiting between the men's and women's cottages was winked at. Preparations began as early as October. With childlike glee, as if they were breaking the rules at a boarding school, the men began to make dates with the women for Christmas holiday. The marriage tie did not seem to hold. It was a saying that you left your wife in Utica. Half a dozen patients, of course, who had been divorced by their husbands or wives as soon as the TB was diagnosed. Now the staff lectured us all on taking care of ourselves and listening to ourselves, to be selfish with ourselves. We were selfish. Well, I had done very well eating and lying in the open air and walking a little. My fluoroscopes and my x-rays looked so good that Dr. Spidell told me that I could leave. On the day that I left, George, Kelly, McKinley, and Jake the upholsterer came down to the station to see me off. The Rhodes Trust had told me that I could resume my scholarship, so I was going to stay with a friend in Virginia until I set sail for England. I felt that there was a certain arrogance in my departure, in having plans beyond these mountains, in leaving them at all because I left these friends behind. And as we waited at the station for the train, I felt the involved ironies of each of us in the good wishes and goodbyes, and it was George that loosened us up. "Well, you won't be going alone," he said. Well, it seemed to be that I would be. No other passengers were on the platform, and George pointed to two long pine boxes stacked on one end of the platform.
Martha Rebin followed a more unorthodox road to health, camping out for entire summers with her guide, Fred Rice. In a biographical sketch of Martha in a 1975 issue of Adirondack Life, Charles Roseberry said that Martha, in her own way, quote, did for Weller Pond what Thoreau did for Walden Pond, enshrined it in literature. She came to the pond in search of health and found there a way of life.
It was a splendid morning in May when I met my newfound friend and guide, Mr. Fred Rice of Saranac Lake, to begin my journey into what was once known as the Great Wilderness. What had brought me to the boathouse dock this morning was an advertisement in the local paper which read, "Wanted, to get in touch with some invalid who is not improving and who would like to go into the woods for the summer." When Mr. Rice had put this notice in the paper, he had been trying to find a sportsman among the invalids in the village. He had not thought of guiding a woman, and certainly not a sick woman barely out of her teens. I was all that fate provided, however, and he decided in his forthright way that I would have to do. Since my small income did not allow for the services of a guide, he offered to take me into camp for what it was costing me to live in the village. And almost at once, he began the improbable undertaking of molding me into his notion of a model sportsman. When my family and friends learned that I was going to get out of the bed in which I had lain for 3.5 years and go off into the woods to live in a tent on the shore of a remote pond, they were shocked and incredulous. But 3 years of bed rest and as many operations had done nothing for my lungs, and I chose now, rather than undergo the still more serious operation which the doctors were labeling my last chance, to risk a summer in the open. For though I was city-born and bred, a simple life in the woods held a strong appeal for me. Mr. Rice, his white hair contrasting strikingly with the brown and ruddy look of his face, was a portly man and a genial one. I had learned through a friend who had investigated his character that he was reliably related to a local minister and to the mayor of Saranac Lake. I was soon to discover that he was an extremely practical man with a peculiar sense of humor. After a brief greeting, he led me to where his boat was tied at the dock. Beside it floated a loaded canoe into which he now stowed my bags. I was gratified to see, after 3 years of reclining, a cot made up with mattresses, pillows, and blankets resting on the bow and middle seats of the boat, ready to receive me. He knelt now, not without puffing, and steadied the boat while I lowered myself onto the cot. Another guide stood by, skepticism plainly evident on his face. He had never seen a bedridden invalid start up the lake before, and obviously his opinion was that no good would come of it. I was unacquainted with small boats, and when Mr. Rice lowered his 200 pounds into the stern and the boat rocked alarmingly, I clutched the mattress and fervently hoped that he would not lose his cargo before he reached camp, or that if he did, he'd be skillful enough to retrieve it before it sank. Unconcerned, he fastened the bowline of the canoe to a cleat, spun the flywheel of the small outboard motor, and we were on our way. After the cloistered life I had been leading in a small private sanatorium, it was an exhilarating experience to find myself skimming over the blue water, yet tucked snugly into bed. Even to eyes less prison-bound than mine, the landscape must have been beautiful. New green leaves were feathering the trees along the shoreline, and here and there against the darker shade of the evergreens were frothy patches of shadberry blossoms. Mr. Rice leaned forward and shouted above the sound of the motor that there were 34 islands in the lake. In spite of the warmth of the sun, the air still had the rawness of early spring, and I was glad of the blanket. When we got to the head of the lake, Mr. Rice stopped the motor and pointed out some of the mountains to me, in particular, Ampersand and Stony Creek Mountains, the two that would dominate the scenery of Round Lake and Weller Pond toward which we were heading. The brightness of the sunny landscape was overpowering, and it was with relief that I saw the green banks closing in on us as we entered the river. Halfway up the river, we passed through the state locks. When the locks were built some 50 years ago, the upper level of the river had been raised. This had resulted in the flooding of the trees on low ground, and the skeletons of many of these dead trees still stood, sun-bleached and silvery. Many others had toppled over, and their enormous roots, 9 feet across, were fantastic shapes. I wondered what this stretch of river would look like by moonlight. Under the benignity of the sun, it had a weird sort of beauty which appealed to my Celtic imagination. The trip to camp lasted almost 2 hours, and by the time we reached our destination, we had traveled across Lower Saranac Lake and Round Lake, now called Middle Saranac, and through more than 2 miles of the Saranac River to reach the north shore of Weller Pond, which was as far away by boat as it was possible to get from the village without making any carries. The noonday sun was beating down onto the dry, piney campsite, and the air was fragrant with pitch when I stepped ashore. I had no clear idea of what a real woodsman's camp looked like, but certainly I had not expected anything like this. A small, drooping 7 by 9 foot wall tent stood forlornly under an enormous hemlock tree. I went over and looked inside its sagging doorway and saw the springs and mattress of a single bed, one corner of which was resting on the sloping ground, while the other 3 corners were supported by stones. Over the bed, from a wooden frame and hanging slightly askew, was suspended a mosquito netting canopy. I looked around and began to wonder where Mr. Rice expected to sleep, when he answered that question by bringing the cot up from the boat and setting it up under a pine tree. Near the fireplace, which consisted only of a few big stones placed in a rough semicircle, lay a scattering of pots and frying pans, their black bottoms dejectedly turned to meet the newcomer's gaze. A dilapidated table, green with mold, held some heavy, chipped crockery and some black-handled kitchen knives and forks. There was not so much as a box to sit on. It was clear that there was to be no pampering on this camping trip. I had wanted to return to a primitive existence, and Mr. Rice was giving me no reason to quarrel with his interpretation of primitive. As I stood looking about me, my teeth suddenly began to clatter, and in spite of the warmth of the sun, I shook with a chill. I became alarmed. What if the dire predictions of my friends were coming true already, and the long trip on the open lake, this early in the season, had given me pneumonia? Mr. Rice dealt with my display of weakness in characteristic fashion. After the first startled glance, he appeared unconcerned. "Better lie down on the cot, hadn't you?" I stretched out under the pine while he went down to the boat and brought up an armful of bedding, which he he dumped on top of me. Then he continued to unload the boats. After a few moments, the shivering stopped, and I began to feel pleasantly warm. My common sense reasserted itself. It did not seem likely that I could be in any grave danger if my companion was so unworried that he scarcely glanced in my direction. When the warmth of the bedding became oppressive, I threw it aside and sat up. Mr. Rice paused in his work. "Scared by what you saw, were you?" He laughed heartily. "You'll find you can live in comfort without a lot of things you've been used to having around you." He picked up some of the bedding and jammed it behind my back in place of pillows. Then he went over and built a fire in the fireplace. When it began to burn, I lay back and sniffed the air as one already competent to judge the wood by its smoke. My guide now hung a blackened kettle of water over the fire, and while he waited for it to boil, he made other preparations for lunch. He opened a can of corn, and then he reached for a gray agate pot to heat it in. The pot was so new that the label was still on it, but I opened my eyes wide when I saw its shape. I had not seen such a vessel since my pre-kindergarten days, and it was a bit startling to renew its acquaintance under the circumstances. Noticing my look of surprise, he grinned. "My wife won't trust me with any of her good kettles, says I blacken them all up. She found this new chamber vessel in the attic and said it was a pity to let it go to waste." He dumped the corn into it, and as he spoke, and set it on a warm stone of the fireplace to heat. For a man who must have done much of his own cooking when in the woods, I found Mr. Rice singularly unskillful at assembling a meal. No doubt his wife was aware of this, for I noticed that she had cooked several vegetables and put them in cans to be reheated. Mr. Rice picked up a coffee can, explaining that it contained spinach, and set it in a pot of hot water to heat. When it was time to measure out the coffee, he found a spoon, opened the other coffee can, and found that it contained spinach. After several other minor setbacks, lunch was ready. But when I sat down to the table, and saw Mr. Rice begin to ladle out corn from the chamber vessel, the association of ideas was almost more than my invalid's appetite would stand.
Thomas Bailey Aldrich, 19th century author, editor of Atlantic magazine, and friend to Mark Twain and other literary figures of his day, lived for a few years on Saranac's Park Avenue with his tuberculous son Charles. Aldrich's years here were sad, for Charles succumbed to the disease in 1904. While still hoping for a cure, Aldrich built a large house and continued his habitual writing. Here is an excerpt from one of his letters. "You would get a book out of these surroundings. The village of Saranac is unique, and the natives are uniquer. Their lives are very simple and accumulative. No style at all. The Saranackers, like the folk described by David Harum, don't dress for dinner, they dress for breakfast. A thrifty people with very large ideas of the lavishness becoming in foreigners, i.e. persons from New York and Boston and other partly civilized centers. There is much wealth and little show among this part of the population, which consists of invalids and their families and an occasional misguided guest. When all is said, there is a charm in the place. There is something in the air to heal the heart of sorrow." Henry Larum was a native of Saranac Lake and son of an Episcopal clergyman. He attended local schools and graduated from the University of Virginia. In addition to being a distinguished English professor at several colleges, he wrote 6 widely acclaimed children's books. Poor health forced him to return to this area in the early 40s. It was not until the last 10 years of his life that Henry wrote poetry. His poems brought images of his past accurately and clearly into being again, closing the gap between then and now.
The Island. From the dark hours out of the mist, I hear faintly the cry of a haunted loon. Waves gently lift the rocks where minnows maneuver gracefully. Light shows a black-capped chickadee in a pine glitter, while the dead tree on the point, a woodpecker telegraphs. The yellow birch flashes The message from sandy shallows and the long-nosed pike nudges along the reef. The needle mound of the ant city launches pack trains up the trees, headed towards the clouds, and across the sky, a hawk slides silently. My island blazes for a moment now. Each rock, each foot of waterline, bright, clear, beloved, then fades, flattens, yellows, like an ancient photograph, and shreds into darkness.
Porch Sleeper, Saranac Lake, 1910. Chill woke me in the night to a world tight with frost. From porch windows, the snow crust reached the cliffs streaked in ice. Somewhere, a tree cracked in loneliness. And my breath, frosting the blankets, ran as shallow as the ice-filled stream. Until I heard the bells, clear and sharp as icicles. My mind's eye saw them perched above the horse's neck. The sleigh, like my father's, red with 2 scarlet pom-poms slicing through the night. Then something urgent, an increase in rhythm, a slap of the reins across the horse's back, and I knew that snugged under a buffalo robe, his feet on a heated soapstone, the doctor drove toward the midnight hemorrhage.
Charles Swayze Barnett, known to Saranac Lake as Beanie, came here to cure, and cure he did, for he spent 70 years here until his death at age 90. Beanie was well known for his Trotty Veck messengers. Trotty Veck is a Dickens character who trots around delivering messages of good cheer. Beanie and his friend Seymour Eaton Jr. conceived the idea of publishing inspirational messages because, quote, there are thousands of people all over the world who are in need of a message of cheer. We will give it to them. If they can pay for it, fine. If they can't, we will send it just the same. 4 million copies later, publications of the messages ceased. Beanie loved the outdoors, birds, fishing, and his community.
Old Beanie. In a time of trouble, Beanie was my psychiatrist. Into his boat of an afternoon, he put 2 plug casting rods, a net, 2 sandwiches, a small pointed roof under which he placed his caramel-colored spaniel. He added 1 mason jar for personal relief, 2 cans of beer, 2 big cigars, and me. Out on the quiet water, he taught me casting until my thumb controlled the line so well that I could drop the bait between 2 lily pads at over 30 feet. Dark woods surround that pond, and nature rests there easily, held by a bass snapping at an insect, by a woodpecker rattling against a distant pine, and the glitter of sunfish in the shallows. It pulled me back, bending me like a rod tip, back to where man, the animal, could concentrate the way a cat does, patient, guileful, and above all, content. The sun sank through orange-tinted water. A breeze rose for a moment, riffling waves against the bow. Old Beanie used the mason jar. We had supper, sipped our beers, and lit up our cigars. Frogs grunted in the twilight. A wood thrush blew low flute notes to us, and we felt part of pond, of bird, of little skating water buds and lily pads. That was Beanie's therapy. And once in a while, we even caught a fish.
Although Saranac Lake has changed radically since these recollections mysterious something which promotes a more reflective, more balanced life. Thank you.